Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Little Rock, where love is our teaching and service is our prayer. I am Stephanie Judkins, Farmer Finn. I am currently the DRE here, so you've seen me around a couple of times. I now invite my very good friend and just about as close to a brother as a person could get, Skylar Shankles, to come forward and light our chalice.
I'm going to ask you all to rise as we say together the affirmation of covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other. And you can stay up because we're going to sing. Well, I have to begin by telling you what that sermon title means. When I was 25, I moved to Long Island, New York, to take a job as administrator for a classical music, chamber music ensemble called the Seacliff Chamber Players. It was there that I found the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Huntington, where I became a Unitarian Universalist. And in that faith community, I first discerned my call to ministry. They later ordained me. Also, in that community, and only there, I found the courage to come out as gay. I was out at church, nowhere else. This was the late 1980s and early 1990s. The environment of my coming out was the AIDS crisis that Ronald Reagan so badly mishandled. Organizations like ACT UP and Gay Men's Health Crisis dominated public discourse in the gay community. We were just learning to call it the gay and lesbian community. Soon we'd be calling it GLB, and soon after that we started putting lesbians first, LGB. And I'm told that change came about to honor the many lesbians who cared for HIV patients when nobody else would. I wasn't aware of that reason for it at the time. I thought it was just gay men taking a feminist stand. But it was more than that. And we've been adding letters ever since, as our collective consciousness has grown to recognize the full variety of ways we humans locate ourselves around sex and gender. In those years, I became a regular reader of a literary magazine called Christopher Street. Christopher Street in Greenwich Village is where the Stonewall Inn is located, where in 1969, drag queens of color led a successful resistance to yet another New York police raid on a gay bar, the event which Pride Month commemorates. And so good to know that person's name and middle name. So, Christopher Street, the name of this magazine, had that resonance for us. Though articles and opinion pieces about the AIDS crisis and its impact on the community did appear, the pages of Christopher Street were mostly devoted to literature, theater, music, and art produced by gay men. Fiction, reviews, interviews, and articles about the New York gay community and its history were its normal fare. And there, I first learned about the poet Wystan Hugh Auden. In his 20s, Auden was already being hailed as the next great poet in the English language, heir to the laurels of William Butler Yeats and T.S. Eliot. His poetry was considered a model of modern style. To describe it, critics soon coined the term Audenesque. When he was 21, Auden went to Berlin. His letters to his school friends, Christopher Isherwood and Stephen Spender, inspired them to follow him there. The musical Cabaret, you might know, is built on Isherwood's first-hand descriptions of early 1930s Berlin. Just months before the Blitzkrieg, Auden and Isherwood moved to New York. Isherwood soon moved on to California, but Auden stayed and became a celebrity fixture of the New York literary and gay communities. I remember reading an article about him in Christopher Street, a memoir, which included this sentence, which has stuck in my memory. Auden felt that his homosexuality, like his other foibles, was simply Audenesque and not to be discussed. That's what my title references. Simply Audenesque and not to be discussed. In subsequent reading about Auden, I have learned what unspoken complexity lay beneath that perception of him. First of all, with his inner circle of friends, he certainly did discuss his homosexuality. And eventually he spoke about homosexuality publicly, if often elliptically. Auden had a long journey from being taught that his homosexuality was sinful to believing instead, under the influence of Freud's writings, that it was a medical condition to be managed, to at last accepting it and choosing it. At the same time, choosing to return to his Anglican faith. He famously said that a writer's story does not illuminate his art, which is obviously false. But in his day, his story would taint his art in the eyes of most. There's a famous story about Eleanor Roosevelt being mobbed by reporters who wanted her to comment on the appointment of a man whose homosexuality was an open secret in Washington. Well, there is this famous story about Eleanor Roosevelt being mobbed by reporters who wanted her to comment on the appointment of a man whose homosexuality was an open secret in Washington to the State Department. This was seen as a national security risk. He could be too easily blackmailed. To their frustration, she would only talk of how highly qualified he was. Finally, one of the reporters blurted out colorful words to the effect of, "He's gay." She replied, "Nevertheless." This sort of public discourse is what Auden and his art were up against. Writers who were known to be gay, like Auden and Isherwood and Spender, or James Baldwin, or Gore Vidal, or Tennessee Williams for that matter, did not identify as gay writers. They were writers who, incidentally, were gay. That dynamic was the reason that Christopher Street magazine existed, to give gay literature, to create that as a category and make gay writers more visible, to help us all get over a cultural habit of distancing ourselves from anything not heterosexual. I've noticed that Auden's contemporary, Joseph Campbell, the great scholar of mythology, talked all around Auden, taking up the same themes found in Auden's poetry and lectures, talking about Yeats and Eliot and the artist's role in society, offering a perspective very similar to Auden's, without ever mentioning his name. I have a hard time believing Campbell never read him. I wonder if that, too, isn't evidence of how everyone back then distanced themselves from anything queer. Well, times changed. Auden died in 1973, only 4 years and 3 months after Stonewall, and he was no longer in New York then. By the time I came out among my church friends, American culture had experienced a generation of gay liberation activism. In 1980, being gay was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual's list of mental illnesses. Being openly gay could still invite violence, and systemic oppressions like state exclusion from marriage were still in place. And anti-gay religious teachings persisted then as now. But new religious voices were emerging, and the space of domestic partnership had been carved out in law in many places so that same-sex commitments could be socially acknowledged. AIDS came along just at that moment. Despite the horror of AIDS, though, it was not a time without hope. But it was still a time of categorizing. That's why we had to keep adding letters. As I contemplated my calling to the ministry, I came to feel that I had to choose whether or not to be an openly gay minister, and then figure out how I would navigate the consequences of my choice. I didn't feel called to a ministry of removing the logs from the eyes of person after person, of being the light that scattered the shadows of prejudice against that then oxymoronic idea, a gay minister, of enduring the hard labor of helping people set aside their unwillingness to be vulnerable with and pastored and cared for by someone whose sexuality they had learned to scorn, had been taught to scorn. It seemed to me easier to be single and simply Audenesque, never discussing my sexuality. Who wants to know about their minister's sexuality anyway, I thought. To complicate matters, after coming out at church, I had unexpectedly fallen head over heels for a woman in the church choir. And we became a couple for a while. Our church friends didn't bat an eye. So at the time, I was thinking, maybe I'm bisexual. And back then, I knew being bisexual was a fundamental barrier to trust. It became an issue in my relationship with that woman in the choir, even though I didn't identify as bisexual. I didn't want to be bisexual. What if this relationship ended, as it later did? Coming out to a date as bisexual in the AIDS crisis era was a sure way not to get a second date, whatever genders you were. So I was simply Audenesque about it all. In the midst of all of this, I was writing regularly to my college friend, Greg, with whom I'm still close. He's my artist and actor friend out in Seattle. We wrote letters to each other for years on real paper with stamps and everything. And I wrote him my thoughts about my sexuality, and he wrote back a line that is stuck in my memory through the years, and back then became a kind of compass for me. He wrote, "I don't think that people are homosexual or heterosexual or bisexual. I think people are sexual, and they do different things with it." That was liberating for me. I didn't have to choose a category. I could be me. And it wasn't a required topic of conversation. So I decided to carry on being simply Audenesque. For nearly a quarter century now, I've devoted myself first to my call to ministry and remained single, seldom dated, sublimated all of that into music and art and scholarship. When solitude sagged into loneliness, my cats could comfort and cheer me. I made it all work, sometimes in both senses. I made it all work. And it took a toll. As I approach 25 years in the ministry, I'm ready for a different approach. And as times have changed yet again, I think it's high time I approach ministry differently and also strike a better balance for myself. It won't do anymore to be simply Audenesque when in public discourse so many of our elected political leaders are intent on reversing more than a century of social progress around acceptance and inclusion and understanding of people like me and of so many other categories of people who have been systematically denied, shamed, diagnosed, excluded, marginalized, insulted, beaten, and killed because they are who they are. Don't say gay? Not anymore. Not in light of all we've learned collectively about human gender and sexuality. I've never felt anything but male, yet I do understand that neither biological sex nor gender identity conforms to the long accepted and institutionalized binary conception of them that we were all taught. Some people feel the truth of this in their own person and claim a non-binary identity. Their truth deserves our respect. My own experience has taught me that love and sexual attraction are about a deep connection to a person, a whole person, not to a category of persons, not to a set of bodily specifications or prefabricated gender roles they must measure up to. Love is of the Spirit. It rolls with whatever fleshly configuration it finds and seeks to grow into harmony with the divine. And the divine always transcends the limits of our human categories, always the more, never the less. Collectively, Americans have always stretched ourselves through democratic processes to hold a vision of love that fails no one. We have striven generation after generation toward collective liberation. I'll say more about all of that next week. The vision of beloved community where each is a beloved, a community that redeems the irredeemable, comforts insufferable suffering, forgives rejection, and stretches to make room for mutual acceptance, understanding, and more love, ever more love. This is the vision that brings out the best in us, individually and collectively. So we must lean into it and live it. What else would we do? Today, I say gay. Yes, I do. And yes, I am. And nobody should have to refrain from disclosing publicly and appropriately who they are, whichever of the letters is theirs. Because admire him as I do, I'm no Auden. I'm me, and my experience has shown me it is to be discussed. It is. So, let it be. So may it be. Amen. As Schuyler extinguishes the chalice, let's say together our closing words in your order of worship. Go out into the world in peace, have courage, hold on to what is good, return to no person evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings, and may we each and all grow into harmony with ever-expanding divine love.